Hello and welcome to our first Lunchtime Dial-In of 2024. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are looking forward to sharing information on the latest updates as they relate to churches and Christian charities, and we really hope that you find today's session helpful. My name's Jackie Fletcher and I will be hosting today, and I'm joined by three of my colleagues on the panel. We have Rachel Steeden, who is our Head of Legal, Lawrence Duplessis, who's our Director of Church and Charity Professional Services, and we have Stephen Matthews, who is one of our senior consultants. So here at Stewardship, our mission is to transform generosity by making giving easy, inspiring greater generosity and strengthening Christian causes, which is the purpose of today's dial-in. If you'd like to find out more about the many ways that we can support your church or charity, you can check out all of our services and resources on our website, or do feel free to call our church and charity team. They would love to speak to you. The number's on your screen now, and it will also be sent out in the follow-up email later today. If you'd like to make sure you receive the follow-up materials, including the podcast recording, you'll need to ensure that you are signed up to the Dial-In mailing list. If you haven't yet done that, just email us to find out how, and we'll send you the link. So in today's session, we are going to be covering the following things. We are going to be talking about new changes to company law and what this means for your charity. We're going to be looking at how to deal with tricky or challenging donations. We're going to take another look at church and charity financial reserves, and we're going to wrap up with a brief update on the Charities Act implementation. And we'll wrap up with our usual Q&A session at the end. So do bring your questions on today's topics. If you have questions today during the presentations or indeed during the Q&A session, please use the chat function to ask them. We'll answer as many as we can in the time we have together. If you haven't joined us before, the instructions are on the screen now. If you have emailed me your questions prior to this morning, then I have already got those, so no need to send those again. And before we start with our agenda, let's just pray. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to take this time to consider the ways that we can strengthen our Christian causes. We thank you for each church and charity represented here as they work for your kingdom, and pray that what is shared will give knowledge, integrity, and confidence, and that we will be good witnesses for you. Help us to serve you well for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. So first up, we have Lawrence, who is going to outline the new changes to company law and what this might mean for your church or charity. Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Now, the government is taking steps to clean up governance of companies registered in the UK with greater powers and new responsibilities for Companies House. Now, this is mainly aimed at combating fraud and other types of economic crime. And there was a recent incident with an apparently mass submission of over 800 possibly fraudulent filings demonstrate these risks. But unfortunately, charitable companies are also caught up in these new regulations. Now, we've previously given a fuller overview of the Act, and we'll include a blog in the follow-up email. But in short, however, Companies House is changing from a passive recipient of information, undertaking almost no verification, to an active regulator and verification agent. Now, a short recap of the main implications specifically for charitable companies is in order. So with effect from 4 March 2024, so that has come and gone, all companies have to register an appropriate address with Companies House, which means PO boxes will no longer be acceptable. Practically, this means an address where documents delivered will come to the attention of a person who acts for the company. So that's the basic definition, and where delivery can be acknowledged. And that was effective immediately from the 4th of March. Companies must also have an email address registered with Companies House. So when they incorporate from 4 March onwards, or with their next confirmation statement from the 5th of March 2024 for existing companies. So charitable companies have to file a confirmation statement with Companies House every year to say their information is still accurate, and they'll have to update that email address at that point. And they must also now, as part of that confirmation statement, confirm their future activities will be lawful. on incorporation or with their confirmation statements filed from 5 March onwards again. Other changes on restrictions on names for companies are probably less relevant for most existing charities, but you can see those are quite important and wide-ranging. Now, other changes with uncertain implementation dates include the identity of all directors will have to be verified. You will be surprised at how many Donald Ducks and Mickey Mouses are company directors in the United Kingdom. Now, this will be the case for all new companies before registration, and other directors will have to be verified over a period of time. And that's to be confirmed, but currently we understand it's planned for later in 2024, but not effective just yet. Companies House promises to provide a service to do this using existing identity documents such as passports, but we still await details. The second point coming is that charitable companies will no longer be able to send hard copies of their annual accounts to Companies House, and they will have to file these accounts electronically using acceptable software. Now, Companies House expects to roll out these requirements over 2 to 3 years, and small and micro entity companies which aren't charitable will now also have to file profit and loss accounts, so that's a change for them too. But charitable companies are not able to file under those regimes in any event. So that's quite a big change for a lot of charitable companies who might prepare their own accounts. Now, positively, companies won't have to keep certain registers internally anymore. So a register of directors home addresses, secretaries, and persons with significant control are the main ones there. These will be filed with Companies House, and that will be the official record. So charitable companies will still have to keep registers of members, relevant for charitable companies, particularly where, for example, you've got a church membership, which is distinct from the trustees, and they might be the members of the company, and registers of debentures issued. But there's some relief there. So the question on everybody's lips, what do we need to do now? Now, the most immediate considerations are clearly related to having an appropriate address, especially if your charitable company is currently registered with a PO box address, and you must be in a position to provide an email address to Companies House if they don't already have one for your company. Now, these should be addressed urgently. Resolving the address issue might be difficult, though, if you don't own your own premises. For example, a church rents a school hall, and that's where they meet. But there might be other solutions to consider. For example, if one church rents another building and the host church is willing to receive post for the renting church, that renting church could set that host church's address as the registered address. Or alternatively, might have to be a residential address of one of the trustees or the company secretary, with the associated risks of making that information public, or an office or a building of a related or a sympathetic charity, or the charity might have to pay for a virtual office service. You can search for that on the internet, virtual offices that receive post for you and will make sure that it comes to your attention. But there's obviously a cost involved. Now, if a charitable company doesn't provide an appropriate address, Companies House will provide their own address instead. So they will substitute the gap there with their own address. Or if you provide an address that's not an appropriate one, or you've still got a PO box as your address, they will substitute that for Companies House's address, and you will have 28 days to correct that, following which they can take enforcement action, which could be quite serious. So definitely an urgent thing to address. Now, that's what needs to get done now. What do we need to start thinking about? Coming further down the line are the requirements to file accounts electronically using software and verifying the identity of directors. Now, like I said earlier, we don't yet have further details on exactly how this will work and the estimated timescales, but if your charitable company prepares its own accounts, or your current independent examiner, for example, does not have the capacity to file your accounts using recognized software, it could be worth considering your options now. There is a significant capacity pressure in the accounting sector. We see that all the time, and a last-minute decision might be too late. Now, Stewardship's accounts examination services team will be able to help and advise you, so do get in touch if you are concerned about this. But having said that, given all of this additional regulation, it might well be worth considering the option of converting the charitable company to a charitable incorporated organization, a CIO, another type of charity. Converting to a CIO gives all of the benefits of being incorporated as a charity, so existing as a legal entity itself, not as the trustees collectively for a trust. And those include the limited liability for trustees. The charity can own property in its name, not in the trustee's name, and so on. But it does all of that without the burdens of company regulation. So we've got more information in a related blog, which again we'll send out after the call. And please do get in touch with us if you have any questions. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Lawrence. And if this does apply to you, then the slides will be sent out in the follow-up email, along with links to all of the further information on this topic. Moving on to our second item today, it's great to welcome Rachel, who's going to share some important information on donations. Rachel.
Thanks, Jackie. So as a charity, you're dependent on your donors to provide the funds that you need for your ministry. However, accepting some donations might actually do your charity more harm than good. Personally, I think these issues can be particularly tricky for Christian charities. So on the one hand, we're rightly concerned to honour God in the way we steward our finances, and we wouldn't want to bring the gospel into disrepute by being associated with tainting funding. On the other hand, we know that we believe in a God who redeems, and we know that God can bring good things out of bad things. So, for example, if we look at the story of Zacchaeus, we see how meeting Jesus transforms his life, and how Zacchaeus responds by giving generously from money which he obtained in an immoral way. So we need to approach this topic as Christians, and also with an eye to our charity law duties. So what does charity law say? The starting point is that you should accept any donation that is offered to your charity. And that principle was recently reaffirmed in new guidance from the Charity Commission. So that's where you start. You should accept any donation unless it would be unlawful for you to do so. Some examples of where it would be unlawful for you to accept the donation include where the donation is from the proceeds of crime, if the donor lacks mental capacity to make that donation to you, or if the donation is given for purposes which are outside of your charitable objects. Now, in some ways, those cases are quite clear, yes or no. But what about the tricky cases where it's a bit grey? So there are a few reasons why you might be uncertain about whether it's appropriate to accept a donation. There are a few aspects to think about here. So first of all, are the concerns about the donor? For example, I came across a case where a children's charity declined a donation from a donor because safeguarding concerns had been raised about this donor. I also came across a case where a Christian charity declined a donation from a well-known Christian leader who'd had to leave ministry after moral failure. How about the way in which the funds have been raised? So, for example, would your charity be happy to accept funds which have been raised from a lottery? Or would you feel that it was inappropriate for your ministry to be associated with funds raised from gambling? Or the example that kicked off the original Charity Commission guidance in the first place, the raising of funds through something called the President's Club, where there was a men-only dinner served by attractive ladies skimpily dressed as the waitresses. And some charities quite understandably felt that they didn't want to receive funds that had been raised in that way. But you might be quite happy with the donor, you might be happy with the way in which the funds have been raised, but what about the source of the funds? So, for example, the British Heart Foundation won't accept donations where the source of those donations relates to the tobacco industry, because quite understandably, they feel that the source of the funds would undermine their cause. Finally, even if you're happy with the donor, the way the money has been raised and the source of those funds, are there any proposed restrictions on the gift? Are there restrictions on the gift which might put an undue burden on your charity? For example, is a donor wanting to fund a specific project without paying a fair share of your general core overhead costs? Or is a donor wanting recognition which goes beyond a simple acknowledgement of their generosity? So, as with any decision really for your charity, the thing you need to consider is what is in your charity's best interests. in making that decision, here are some factors for you to think about in weighing up what is in your charity's best interests. So firstly, what is the value of the donation? What could this donation achieve for your ministry? Secondly, is there any conflict between the donation and your charity's purposes? Next, would accepting the gift make it harder to attract donations in future? Is there a risk of harm to your charity's reputation amongst its supporters or beneficiaries if you accept the gift, or indeed if you decline the gift? Is any reputational damage likely to be short-lived or longer lasting? And finally, what's the cost for the charity of complying with any conditions that the donor wants to put on the gift? As I say, this is a principle you'll be very familiar with, that in any trustee decision, you need to act in the best interest of your charity. Here are just some specific things to think about in this context of accepting or refusing a donation. So, key takeaways, what should you do? Here are our 3 top tips. First, please make sure you've got a policy in place. It is much easier to deal with these questions if you've agreed a policy in advance. It avoids a panic when the issue comes up, and it avoids the decision being swayed by personal views of the trustees rather than by what is overall in the best interests of your charity. Secondly, please do have a look at your financial procedures. So at the moment, would you actually know if a donor or their source of funds was problematic? What level of due diligence are you doing, and is that appropriate? Thirdly, please act as quickly as possible. It's much easier for a charity to refuse to accept a donation than to return it having accepted it. So it's almost always better to deal with this as soon as possible. If you've got any other questions on this, please do add them to the chat and we'll answer them at the end. Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Rachel. That was a great summary, lots to think about there. So let's move on to our 3rd topic for the day. And Stephen is going to be bringing us a valuable reminder about our charity reserves. Stephen.
Thank you, Jackie. Now, here I'm talking about money, the bit of money that the church charity has, which is held in reserve. Reserves are that part of a charity's funds that are freely available to spend on any of the charity's purposes and kept back and not to be spent at this point of time. Now, why am I recommending that we look again at this issue? Because for many of us, it may seem that this is thought of as well worn, or having been thought about by the treasurer for long enough. Or it may not seem interesting or even relevant, let alone high priority, as part of the life of a church or charity. But I think there are a few important reasons to look at this. Firstly, having a good idea about the right amount to hold is really helpful in planning church strategy. And that amount changes as a result of changing circumstances. And so many of the accounts we look at suggest that this has not actually been thought about recently at all. I'll explain why in a minute. Secondly, the Charity Commission have an expectation of what trustees should do and phrase it like this. They say, regularly monitor and review the effectiveness of the policy, that's the reserves policy, in the light of the changing funding and financial climate and other risks. Now, why do I suggest that many churches have not thought about this recently? This comes from reading the accounts, listening to churches, and seeing what they say about what they hold. Sometimes it is the lack of saying anything at all. I'll say more on Charity Commission comment on this. Sometimes it is the way the policy is worded, being identical to that of years ago. Now, that's possibly valid, but often not. Sometimes the figures quoted are no longer in line or even anywhere near the current financial position. And sometimes, and this is a personal comment, because the policy is so very often, they held reserves of 3 months of expenditure, as if this was a standard recommendation of the Charity Commission, which it is not. In their original version of CC19, their guidance on reserves, they used this as one of their examples, and it sort of stuck and became the gospel according to the Commission. We should hold 3 months. But it is just an example, and you'll see more why this is the case in a minute. Now, why do accounts need to make any comment on reserves? The Charity Commission, in their 2023 updated guide, Charity Reserves Building Resilience, say this: all charities must include in their annual report their policy on reserves, stating the level of reserves held and why they are held. Where the charity does not have a reserves policy in place, it should include a statement to that effect. Now, must, being used by the Charity Commission, is a strong word. Their view is that the accounts cannot properly explain the financial situation without that information. The Commission go on to say this, that they expect trustees to decide, publish, implement, and monitor their charities' reserves policies so that they can comply with their legal duties. These are strong words on their view of its importance. Now, so what difference does it make to what a church or charity actually does? In my experience, it can make actually a lot of difference. I find that some churches think they can't afford some important project because, in inverted commas, they have to hold at least £X at the bank to comply with ... Some churches can't answer the question of why you're holding what you are holding, sometimes because they're holding incredibly high amounts. Whilst other churches appear to change their circumstances massively, e.g. take on a major long-term expenditure such as a significant lease, and not think whether the relatively small amount of reserves they hold is still the right amount going forward. Let me give you an example. Say a church of 120 people rents a school hall on a termly agreement, say £6,000 a term, and is holding £20,000 in reserves. Now, it moves to its own building under a 10-year lease agreement with a 5-year break clause. It's got the same annual cost, £6,000 a term or £20,000 in a year, but its minimum commitment for the property has changed from 4 months, that's one term, of £6,000 to 60 months, that's 5-year break clause, in other words, £90,000. So in the first instance, you've only got a commitment to future rent of £6,000. In the second, you've got a 5-year commitment totaling £90,000. So what happens if the income of the church starts dropping or a new area of ministry starts to become important? The church is less flexible than it used to because of its commitment to the rent. So the trustees would be looking to see if reserves should be built up to ensure the church can weather changes in income expenses where they happen suddenly. As the Charity Commission put it, this issue is about resilience. And resilience in our churches and charities is a really important factor. I would very quickly add that the resilience of a church or charity is not all about the money that's in the bank. It includes many wider issues, one of which is the commitment to those funding the ministry, which could be called off-balance sheet finance. If they're committed, then that's really helpful. Now, that point alone is one factor that shows why two charities having apparently similar situations may need very different approaches to the reserves they hold. Let me explain. Two churches which I've been part of in my past both had about £250,000 of income and expense, but had very different circumstances. And it wasn't to do with leases. One, the membership was largely middle-aged, home-owning, high-earning in a suburban area. If we needed £50,000 in a hurry, we'd just ask. And by next week, we'd have £70,000. People could give it out of their own reserves or easily borrow it. Then another church that I moved on to was young, in London Zone 2, had students, single mums, or renters with massive rent commitments. If we needed £50,000 in a hurry, and we asked for it, the response would be, which year do you need it by? They just didn't have that sort of money around or couldn't borrow it. Now, I'm not trying in this talk to explain how much a church or charity should hold in reserves. For some pointers on that, please do look at the Charity Commission guidance and our free briefing paper, How to Set a Church Reserves Policy, which is on our website, and the link will be sent out. This plea is intended to encourage leaders, finance team, and trustees to look again and see that their approach to reserves hasn't fossilized, but is refreshed, and that the right amount of reserves for your ministry is being held for the right reason. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yes, and if you've got any questions, do be popping them in the chat as we carry on through. Our last agenda item today is coming from Lawrence, and he's going to bring us just a brief update on the implementation of the Charities Act. Lawrence.
Thank you again, Jackie. Now, the Charities Act 2022 has now almost fully been brought into operation in 2024, with the latest changes becoming effective from 7 March 2024. And we've previously outlined the other provisions coming into force, and they came into force at the end of 2022 and the middle of 2023. More information about that on our website. Now, one of the key changes that came into effect now is the introduction of a new statutory power allowing trusts and unincorporated associations to amend their governing documents. Now, this power, however, comes with a requirement for the Charity Commission's consent for certain regulated alterations. That is the charitable purposes, trustee benefits, and winding up provisions. So that'll be consistent for all charities. Now, if you change one of those in your governing document, you need the Charity Commission's sign-off. And that aligns it across trusts, unincorporated organizations, companies, and CIOs. Now, the change aims to provide greater flexibility, but making sure that amendments serve the charity's purpose and comply with the legal standards. The other change that came into effect now is that the Act simplifies the process of selling, leasing, or otherwise disposing of charity land. It introduces provisions related to the disposal of land by liquidators and others in control of a charity's assets, as well as changes to what must be included in statements and certificates for both the disposals and mortgages. Now, these changes are probably not as consequential for most charities disposing of land as the other provisions that came into effect in June 2023 in this regard, which amongst other matters broadened the pool of advisors who can advise trustees. So besides chartered surveyors, fellows of the Institute of Estate Agents and certain agricultural valuers can now also advise the trustees when disposing of property. That came into effect June last year. As appropriate for the type of property, of course. You're not going to be able to get an agricultural valuer to value your charity's flat in Islington in London. Equally, you're going to want to go to an agricultural valuer to value agricultural land your charity might own. Remember, charities must take formal advice when disposing of a property or when taking on a mortgage or a loan. That isn't changed. The provisions just broaden the pool of advisors who can advise on disposals and simplifies some of the documentary requirements. Now, the Land Registry have updated their practice guides, but any disposals effected before 7 March 2024 remain subject to the old requirements for certificates and documents. So just be aware of that if that affects your charity. Then charity mergers, they've been given attention to with these changes, with new rules allowing most gifts to charities that merge to take effect as gifts to the merged entity. Now, this provision it simplifies the process and encourages more efficient restructuring where it benefits the charity's objectives. So previously, there was some ambiguity in some of these cases. So where charities merged, particularly, for example, if you have a trust and the trust is converted to a CIO or something, and you have both entities, trustees would keep the old trust open in case there were legacies due to that trust. Or if two charities merge, they keep the one open as a shell entity in order to not lose out on legacies that might accrue to that entity. Because the loophole there was, if in the will in question, the wording was something like, if that charity is in existence at the time, or not if the charity is not in existence, and there was some case law around this, you could see how this could be slightly ambiguous, and there was a fear that charities might lose out on legacies. But this change makes very clear now that if the charities are registered as having merged on the Charity Commission's Register of Mergers, legacies due to one of the former entities will be regarded as being due to the merged entity, regardless of what that wording in the will had said. So It won't be necessary to keep open shell entities or shell trusts any longer. You can go ahead and merge them, but as long as the merger is registered on the Charity Commission's Register of Mergers, that is very important to do. But this is a big step forward and I think a huge relief for the sector. Next change that came into effect, the Act grants the Charity Commission new powers to resolve uncertainties or defects in the appointment or election of trustees. So it's essentially a magic wand to approve such an appointment, remedy any defects, set right any property matters, and remove any uncertainty about the validity of any decisions made by the trustees before regularization of the appointment. And the Commission can now also retrospectively authorize or even order the payment of a trustee or the retention of an unauthorized benefit received by a trustee, addressing issues of equity and fairness in trustees' remuneration. Previously, they could only do so prospectively. So if a charity realized we don't have the ability to pay a trustee for another role. So many cases in churches, you find this where the pastor, the minister is also a trustee. If you don't have permission in your governing document or from the Charity Commission or from the court, which I think is quite rare, and you then pay that person, you needed to regularize that. The Charity Commission couldn't retrospectively say that was okay. They could just do it prospectively. But they will still consider whether there was good reason, though, and questions of value for money for the charity and so forth. But that is another positive step. Not yet enacted, ex gratia payments. So these changes coming into effect now in March means that almost all of the provisions of the Charities Act 2022 have now come into force, barring the changes related to ex gratia payments. So the provisions of the Act enabling charity trustees to make payments they feel morally obliged to make but don't have the legal power to do have been postponed as the government is concerned about the impact on museums experiencing pressure to return objects in their collections. So, for example, the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon sculptures or the Benin bronzes and so on. You might be have read about this in the media, and there's lots of pressure on on museum trustees in this regard. So the government has held back these provisions. They're working to bring them into force, but will likely exclude museum collections from these provisions. So that is still to come. That's the only bit now that hasn't come into force, and it's because of these external factors. Now, as always, get more information from appropriate advisors where necessary, and we definitely be happy to help point you in the right direction as we can, or give appropriate guidance, particularly if you're signed up via our consultancy helpline. And there's more information in our blog on this topic on our website on all of these changes, and we'll send that out after the webinar. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And that brings us to the end of our agenda for today. Now, Lawrence just mentioned our consultancy helpline. I haven't spoken about this for a while, but so for those of you who don't know about this well-kept secret, if you subscribe with a very affordable annual subscription, you'll have access to professional consultants who can answer your questions on a range of topics, including accounting, employment, charity law, and several other areas of governance. If you're already a Stewardship client, the good news is you get a discount on your subscription. So details on this service and how you can sign up will be in the follow-up email after this call. Now, I've also included here a link to our resource hub, which is where you'll find lots of useful information to help you navigate your responsibilities, including our free briefing papers on a range of topics that are pertinent to Christian charities and churches. You'll also find our online shop in the Resource Hub. And I'd just like to highlight that our employment contract packs, which have been produced in partnership with Anthony Collins Solicitors, have recently been updated. If you've previously purchased a pack from us, you can buy an updated version with a discount. You just need to get in touch for your discount code. So if that's of interest to you, do pop along to our Resource Hub or our shop, where you will find these resources. We are almost at the end of our session today. I'm apologies if we didn't get to your question. Do check out the resources in the follow-up email. Hopefully there'll be something helpful there. If not, do feel free to contact us. Just to say, in that follow-up email, we're going to include a very brief survey that should take no more than a couple of minutes to complete. And I know we're all really sick of surveys, but we look at every response. Thank you to those of you who took the time to respond last time. That was so helpful. It's always good to hear from you as well. But if you haven't responded for a while, then please maybe take a few moments to let us know what you think we're doing well. If there's anything else you'd like us to include, we do review all the responses, and we really appreciate your time if you can do that for us. So a heads up, our next dial-in will be on Thursday, the 17th of October 2024, and we hope you'll be able to join us. Please pass on the invitation to anyone you know who may be interested. And finally, it just remains for me to say a big thank you to our panelists, to Rachel and Lawrence and Stephen, for sharing their expertise and for answering all of the questions. And thank you to you for joining us today. We do hope that it's been helpful. We will continue to pray that you and your organisations will be richly blessed and will also be a blessing to those that you serve over the coming months. Bless you. Thank you.